Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've had a good lunch and tete-a-tete sessions. Welcome back to what I regard as a very special session indeed, for a number of reasons. You may recall that last year the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, came to Beyond Borders, and not simply to talk to you all with Alan Little. It was a lovely, interesting talk, but really to launch the Women in Conflict season. The Women in Conflict season was a sort of cultural program which emphasized the role of women in conflict, both in terms of peacemaking, but also in terms of humanitarian assistance, but also in terms of war and whatnot. And we had a number of different cultural projects ranging from exhibitions to theatre pieces, to spoken word events, not just here, but Edinburgh and in the Scottish Parliament. But she also helped start a pilot project about a women's fellowship program to promote peace around the world, following on from Security Council Resolution 1325, which emphasizes the role of women in promoting and making peace, and ensuring that women should be around the negotiating table, but not just there, but heard when it comes to not just making peace, but building peace as well. And it's really as a consequence of that meeting, and her meeting some of my UN colleagues at the last Beyond Borders session, that she decided that she was going to play an active role on behalf of Scotland in the promotion of Security Council Resolution 1325. And in that context, Stefan de Mistura, the Special Envoy for Syria, actually my boss, who's given me permission to be here this weekend, you probably know there's a lot going on in Geneva with Lavrov and Kerry, came to Scotland in October and met the First Minister. And it's as a consequence of that that the first project between Scotland and a special envoy in a peace process was launched. And in May, just after one day after the election, we had an aspect of the Syrian peace process here in the Scottish Parliament in which all the party leaders took part. This was not a partisan SNP project. This was a full-scale project by all the party leaders. As a consequence of that, she put in her manifesto a commitment to train 50 women peacemakers each year for the next 5 years. And we have been given the tasks, at least for the first year, to train those peacekeepers. And so it's as a consequence of that commitment and that dialogue, which happened here, which in a sense emphasizes why it's so important to bring people to a neutral place like Traquair to present new ideas, that all these remarkable women are on the stage. It's also extremely important to me that we give a platform for people who are actually from the region. You know, 2 sessions ago we saw, God bless them, I like them, I respect them, but 5 white men discussing Britain's role in relation to Iraq, but of course there's the other side, those people in the region, and I'm extremely keen to hear their views, not only about that intervention, but about what's happening in their societies. I'll stop soon, but I had a remarkable conversation with Lamia, and I'm going to ask Marie-Joëlle to introduce all the panelists last night. I was in Benghazi about 7 days after the no-fly zone on behalf of a number of organizations to negotiate with the rebel leadership, ostensibly over Lockerbie and IRA Semtex, but also to help build the rule of law. I was absolutely dumbfounded when I got to Benghazi to realize that that revolution had been started by lawyers, dentists, students, ordinary people. We have this vision of Libya today that it's lawless disruption, full of jihadist violence. But the revolution I saw in Benghazi was with people just like you and me, where in actual fact the whole of Benghazi was festooned with graffiti from ordinary young people who were lampooning Gaddafi, and where in actual fact Arab rap artists were making songs, and where women were demonstrating in the freedom squares. And we were talking about this, and we know what's happened since then. I would probably say partly because of the failure of the UK to initiate a civil intervention as opposed to a military intervention, which I supported. But that's why I think it's so important for all of us in here in the UK, but in the West, to really listen to what's happening in the region from people from the region. So it's in that context that we have held this debate. These are our first 1325 fellowship women peacemakers. It will be launched tomorrow with the First Minister. I'm going to ask Marie-Joëlle Zahar, who is a professor of political science from Montreal, to make the introductions. She's been involved in the fellowship program. She's also a former colleague of mine from the United Nations. She's one of 8 mediators on standby, like myself, who flies around the world to support special envoys. Last year I did 222 days on the road. She did far more. She is a remarkable woman who has worked across the MENA region. And lastly, I want to just introduce David Marshall, who is also from the United Nations, and he has had many experiences in the region. He's recently just led the UN investigation into atrocities in South Sudan and wrote a remarkable report that pulled no punches whatsoever under extremely difficult conditions. He was also in Yemen doing the rule of law assessment in 2014 before the talks collapsed. He's part of the Syrian task force, and he did the World Bank Rule of Law Review in 2003 in Iraq. So I've asked him really to listen to what people are saying and perhaps give a perspective from the United Nations. Quite apart from that, he is also my agent in the United States. We will be celebrating, hopefully, the launch of Beyond Borders Santa Fe. Actually, David very much is behind that project. So I thank him for all his efforts. So, Marie-Joëlle, if you don't mind, take the floor.
Thank you so very much, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. As the chair, as the person who's had the privilege to work with the fellows around here, I would very much like for their voices to be the dominant ones. So I will not be spending much time introducing them. I will simply say who they are and where they're from, and I will ask them to start by introducing themselves, and more importantly, by telling us how, from lawyers, engineers, ordinary citizens, they decided to take this journey that has made them into peacemakers. The 4 panelists, there. Sorry. Technology is never reliable. What can we do?
Just set it on your knee.
Okay, great. So the 4 panelists you have before you have a variety of trajectories and experiences, which are very humbling, including to a person like me who spent the last 25 years working in and on conflict zones. So without further ado, from my extreme right, we have Choman Hardi, who is from the Kurdistan region of Iraq, Muna al-Maghafi from Yemen, Lamia Abusedra from Libya, and Weamm Youssef from Syria. So I'm going to ask them to please take turns introducing themselves and telling us about their journey. Choman?
Right. As you just heard, I was born in Iraqi Kurdistan, and my family fled several times to Iran when I was a child. And then eventually I sought asylum in the UK in '93. I completed my education here, and there was a number of years when I was very happy in England, and I thought I'll never go back. And I didn't engage with Kurdish issues because I thought it was very traumatic and full of dead-end political arguments that got nowhere. I had an English husband at the time, and I was making a name for myself as a poet, and very much in the mainstream, in a way. And that's one wonderful thing about this country, that you can actually come and make your way into the main circles. It is open. Then I started my PhD research about refugee women and their mental health, gender and mental health, and after that, my postdoc research about women survivors of genocide in Kurdistan. And obviously this involved doing a lot of field work back home and realizing more and more that whatever I do here, there are thousands of other people who could do the same. But back home, there's a grave need for people to go home and make things happen. And if you don't do certain things, nobody else will do them. So I had been thinking about moving back for a number of years, and eventually, one of my passions, of course, is gender equality. Eventually, I moved back to work in the American University of Iraq in Soleimani. I teach literature, I chair the English department, and I teach also feminism. And of course, I have links with the women's movement and take part in many campaigns for gender equality, but also for diversity in general, ethnicity, religion, trying to address sexuality, but not being very successful. So that's where we are.
My name is Maghafi. I come from Yemen, which is one of the countries that was impacted by the wave of Arab Spring protests. But I imagine, Yemen has been one of the least covered countries in the media. When the protests began in Yemen in 2011, I was working with Save the Children in health and nutrition projects in rural areas of Yemen. And never did I imagine that I would actually change career fields. But the Yemeni protest was quite extraordinary in that in a country where you have the second highest number of arms per capita in the world, the youth graduates managed to bring Yemenis together from all parts of Yemen, regardless of what their grievances were or what their aspirations for the future of the country were. And so, like many Yemenis, I was no different, and I was very much captivated by this, and I soon joined the youth movement in Yemen, and Yemen really, the protests in Yemen really did bring Yemenis together, and a lot of youth, and really changed the sort of the structured paths we had drawn out for ourselves. And at the moment, I'm working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and within that role, I work with the Human Rights Monitoring Team in monitoring human rights violations by both warring parties, and also working in providing a lot of technical assistance and capacity building to local organizations on the ground, and supporting them in being able to be impartial and to keep a record of the human rights violations in the current conflict.
My name is Lamia Lamia Abusedra. I come from Libya. My background a bit, I graduated from engineering school, had my master's, my PhD actually from here, from the UK, from Exeter. Returned back home as a lecturer in the university. That was 2010. That's my pre-revolution life. Post-revolution, things are very different. When the revolution happened, it wasn't like a set date or a decision that we took. It just happened, and we found ourselves, as I am from Benghazi, where the whole thing ignited. So we became, in Benghazi, every one single person in Benghazi, part of this this movement. We didn't have civil movement or civic actions or civic work before. The most organized people on the ground were the Boy Scouts. We joke about that, but it's true. But when the revolution happens, it's not a decision that you take, it's survival mode, basically. So we started, me personally, just 5 days after the revolution, we got together with a group of Libyan women, and we decided there's 5 fields that we want to start working in. And my technical background as an electrical engineer, I founded a group for data gathering of needy families. As simple as it sounds, this database became the internationally used database when the international aid came in. And that's how I became one of the people working with the Transitional Council when it started to form and the forces started to come together. It's very difficult to describe that part of the revolution. It's very surreal, really, and very humane. As I said, survival mode is what driven us. At the moment, I'm working, or I'm part of the delegation in the peace process happening in Libya as the national dialogue on women track. And until recently, I have never worked on women empowerment issues or women empowerment in general, and I always thought to myself, as a established engineer and member of the society, giving an example is enough for people working on women empowerment, as say. However, what's happening in our countries, we're really, as women, losing ground. So I decided to come back to Libya after 2 years of being away because of the violence, but working in particular on women issues. So that is a brief description, and yeah.
Hi, my name is Weamm. I'm from Syria. I came from Damascus. I'm originally from Damascus suburb. A little about my background. I studied at the Damascus University, English literature, and then I worked with the UNDP as a project assistant on climate change and IDPs. At the same time, I was volunteering on different projects related to refugees, Palestinian refugees in Syria, and also during the Lebanese war, those in 2006, I believe, and how to help the refugees at that time with the Red Crescent and Red Cross in Syria. Later on, I moved to Egypt, and I worked for the Arab League as migration program coordinator. And I did several fellowships as well in Italy, studying migration policies at Oxford, University of Oxford. Studied also forced migration and displacement studies, and then I did finally my master's degree at the University of York in applied human rights. That's some background about my educational background. My professional background started with really in an early age. I was like 22 when I started working for the UNDP, and then moved to the Arab League, like two intergovernmental organizations, different ways of interacting with different parties, but I've always had a kind of flexibility working with my supervisors, who were very helpful in terms of shaping the programs we were working on. I was one of the people who went in on the Libyan borders at the time of Libyan crisis, and worked with the refugees there on both sides of the borders, in Tunisia and in Egypt. And later on, I'm now working with the Gulf Center for Human Rights as a human rights officer, working on research development, protection, and women human rights defenders program. I think the opposite to Yemen, Syria is under spot in media. So everybody is very much aware about the situation in Syria. It's maybe awareness differs from one person to another. My activism started like many of other young people, online activism involved in documentation, circulation of information between activists, and working on more on a virtual community, on creating some platforms for activism. So probably this is a background, yeah?
Well, you got a taste, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. The 4 women here are accompanied by colleagues of there, another 8 extraordinary women, and it was just the luck of the draw, or maybe the wisdom of a computer, that pulled their names from the hat. But they and us have been talking for the past couple days about the situations in their countries, and whether the countries are not covered sufficiently in the media or whether they are covered extensively in the media. It seems very clear to all of us sitting here that the coverage is both very superficial and often lacking impartiality and balance. So what I would like all of them to do is to give us all the benefit of a pair of eyes close to the ground, a pair of eyes that actually cares about the countries, does not necessarily pass judgment, and is capable of seeing things that are missed by our media, that are missed by our politicians, and that clearly matter in terms of understanding what is going on in the countries. So maybe I'll start this time on this side with Lamia, and then move on to Mona, Choman, and Weamm at the end.
Well, what's missing in the media? I would like to just build up to that by a story. I was invited 2012 to speak on behalf of the civil society of Libya and the annual gathering of civil society organization here in the UK, actually in London. And after I told the story, and that was very early on after the revolution ended, people queued to shake my hand, and someone came up to me and said, "Thank you for retrieving our faith in humanity." Now, having said that in that moment in particular, it just clicked. This is not a Libyan story. It shouldn't be a Syrian story. It shouldn't be a Yemenis or an Iraqi story. This is history in the making. This is a story for all humanity, what's happening in the region. And I don't think in that aspect the media really covers that. It does not cover the stories as stories for history, to be involved as human being in these events, not as people coming from the region or people here in the UK as an isolated incident in an isolated geography. That is not the case, and I think from that aspect it's definitely missing in all the media. However, I was incidentally for a short period assigned a Deputy Minister of Information, which is Deputy Minister for Media in my country. And although the technical aspects were under my mandate, however, of course, also the content, we were very, it was very important to make sure that we have a system, and we try to build a system of informing people in Libya. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do, especially when you have a broken system altogether. This is in my country, in Libya. However, like in other parts of the world, like here in the UK, we hear about independent media. We hear about the right of the people to be informed. And still, I feel there is a very big gap in asking for that right from people to really be informed about these sensitive issues, historical moments that people have the right to really understand, and not try to be involved, because everyone in the UK is really involved in these stories one way or another by the involvement of the UK in general. So that's what I would say on this matter.
I mentioned earlier about the Arab Spring, and since the Arab Spring, just very briefly, Yemen has been a theater for a number of conflicts, but I'll focus on the most recent conflict, which has had the highest impact on civilians. So really the current conflict has its underpinnings in really the exclusion of the two groups that really represent two of the largest grievances in the GCC initiative that facilitated Yemen's transition. So when the GCC agreement was signed, the Al-Houthis, which is a Zaidi revivalist movement, which is a branch of the Shias, were not signatory to this agreement, and neither was the secessionist movements, which represents, which also was marginalized during the former regime, and were calling for self-determination of the south, or the former south of Yemen's socialist states. And so but nevertheless, Yemen's revolution transitional process went ahead. So now we see these two groups are very much the key groups, very much key in the current conflict. Also, the Yemeni fighting that's taking place at the moment is taking place against a backdrop of a very urgent humanitarian crisis. Yemen was characterized, and you don't see any of that in the media, unfortunately, when the war broke out. There was already, prior to that, a number of international journalists had already been deported out of the country. So, and also Yemeni media and regional media is very much divided. And so a lot of the media doesn't cover the humanitarian aspects of the conflict, but is rather focusing on territorial gains on the ground. Yemen has been characterized by the UN as an L3 category humanitarian crisis, which basically means that is the most critical humanitarian emergency characterization. So Yemen, in the mainstream media, is very much pigeonholed as a Shia-Sunni conflict, even though really that's not the case. Both the most prominent groups fighting on the ground are really fighting with political aims and not as it's portrayed in the media. Thank you.
So I think the problem is journalists usually have to have tight deadlines, and they have to write articles, and they can't research, and they're not familiar with the area, and they can't really handle nuances and detail very well. Well, some do, but majority don't. I think the oldest conflict in Iraq has been the Kurdish issue. The Kurds were originally promised their own nation state, of course, after the First World War. And this promise was taken back, and they were divided between 4 countries where they found themselves as oppressed minorities. Ever since 1920s, there's been a conflict with the central government over autonomy or some sort of self-rule, and it culminated into genocide in 1988. You know about the gassing of Halabja, of course, but that was only one gas attack. The genocide campaign took place between 7 months, and it involved 281 attacks and killing and mass graving 100,000 people and destruction of 4,000 villages. Of course, at the time, UK and Germany and US were providing raw chemical material to Iraq, so they weren't willing to acknowledge the genocide. And of course, if they say it's genocide, they have to act, and they didn't. So this is the biggest grievance in the Kurdistan region. And finally, it was because Iraq invaded Kuwait and the first Gulf War. There was the uprising in the Shiite south and the Kurdish north, and then the creation of the no-fly zone in the Kurdistan region. And for the first time, we have our own parliament in 1992, Kurdish regional government and parliament. Of course, after that, civil war started between the Kurdish parties, who had no experience of democracy. They had always fought guerrilla warfare from the mountains. There was a period of 4 years of war. And after that, of course, the removal of Saddam Hussein and recreation of a new Iraq, inclusion of the different fractions, of course not completely inclusive, but at least Shiite, Sunni, Kurds were a part of the new government. And all the violence that came after that. More recently, after the Arab Spring, of course, the conflict in Syria and the spillover of refugees, and mainly the coming of ISIS into Iraq has been another major problem. You all know about the Yazidi genocide and the enslavement of women. More than 6,000 women and children were captured by ISIS. The women were sold as sex slaves, but the boys are being trained as fighters and suicide bombers. There are still 3,600 women and children unaccounted for, missing, captured by ISIS. So there is layers and layers of conflict. There's the Kurdish-Arabic conflict, which is now becoming even stronger again because we have Arab IDPs in Kurdistan, and we didn't have them before. And this comes in a context where the central government is not giving the Kurdistan regional government its revenue. 17% of Iraq's revenue was supposed to be given to the Kurds for self-rule for this federal state. And this is not happening for the past year and a half. whereas Arab IDPs still get their salary from the central government, and they come as IDPs and they have money where the host community doesn't. And of course, we also don't have any experience of being a host community because we were always refugees and IDPs ourselves. So this is another conflict that's coming to a head, and nobody's really taking it seriously. I believe it's pretty serious, and it might lead to potential violent conflict. But the major thing at this moment is fighting ISIS. The Kurds on the ground are engaged with fighting ISIS. The reparation and support to the Yazidis who've been uncovered from ISIS, and also the geopolitics of Turkey's involvement with the Kurds in Syria, the Kurds in Iraq, and the Kurds in Turkey. It's a very complex issue, and it's very difficult to see it given justice, really, in the media. And that's why I think those who want to write well about these subjects need to be engaged in these countries for a longer term, a longer commitment, rather than just going there for a week or two and writing something in a rush.
I'll try to wrap up everything my colleague said here, because it's very much related to what we have been discussing in the few past days. We discussed the role of the media and the challenges we think we're facing in the media covering the situation in our countries. I think one of the most important thing in our point of view is coming to the international media is the framing of the situation in Syria, focusing more on some aspects of the situation or the crisis in Syria and neglecting the other sides of it. For example, I mean, framing the situation in Syria in civil war terms, I mean, it's very unlikely to be what is happening in Syria, because it started as peaceful revolution at the very beginning, and then it's become more complex with more people are involved in the situation that become a conflict afterwards. This is one of the things, and the other thing is, of course, focus on ISIS. I mean, Marie-Joëlle mentioned that impartiality is very unlikely to be associated with the media, but when you're focusing on one side only because it's like more tempting or like a very interesting subject to discuss, I mean, focusing on ISIS was one of the problems, because when you're covering the war and you're covering the conflict or covering the uprising and revolution, you should be, in a way or another, equal in the way you're informing your audiences. The problem is with documenting, with reporting on the mass atrocities, what's happening in Syria, neglecting many of the facts and forgetting about many of them. Also, I would like to flag the situation of the refugees that have been covered so much in the media recently. And I don't think that this was the case when the situation was contained in the Middle East, but when it reached Europe, that was more in focus. I mean, these are the things I have now in mind. Also, the root causes of the conflict. It's never been talked about. It's most about what is happening now, what will happen, and like anticipating and focusing on ISIS, counterterrorism. All of these things are not giving justice or not unfair to the situation on the people in Syria. I mean, using negative terminologies as well. Like influx of refugees, submerge of the refugees. Yeah, I mean, these are the things that comes to my mind when I think about the media and its coverage to the Syrian situation.
Well, I guess, it's pretty clear that the complexity and the various layers of the conflict are escaping us, and that in focusing on the things that touch our countries most, whether that be the fear of terrorism or, the concern with the influx of refugees, other stories, important stories of who's on the ground, what's happening to the communities, what are the challenges of those trying to survive in nonviolent ways in the midst of cataclysms, are left untold. And that raises a question of the context in which we conduct our peacemaking efforts. Yesterday, we had the privilege of being invited to dinner with the fellows at Traquair, and David and I found ourselves involved in a lengthy discussion about the context of peacemaking, with very serious concerns about some aspects of that, but also hope, of course, seeing the commitment of the fellows around the table to trying to do things against the tide. So I will ask David to please ask the first question of the period of questions, allow our fellows to answer briefly, and then open it up to all of you. We will have mics in the room. Just signal, keep your hand up, signal that you want to talk, and the mics will be coming to you. We'll also allow our other fellows, if they have something to add, to do that. So, David, why don't you start our question period?
Great, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. So, I mean, in my experience, often the drivers of conflict are often the same. A lack of inclusion, marginalization, discrimination, and a lack of accountability for atrocity crimes, for mass crimes. You often see these in our work, the UN's work in fragile states, and I would suggest they're quite common, I think, in most of these scenarios that we're talking about to some extent or another. So I guess, so the question is that correct? Do you think that one of those is the driver of conflict in your context? Am I missing a driver of conflict, A? And B, what's happening today in each of your respective countries about addressing those, the root causes of conflict / the drivers of conflict around inclusion, around addressing discrimination, and for me, the big issue about accountability, because we discussed last night that one of my great fears is we appear to be in the decade of unaccountability. No one appears to be held accountable anymore. We heard the rhetoric around no more Rwandans, but we have Robert Mugabe was a president of the African Union last year. President Bashir came to Juba, where I was working, to be the mediator. He's indicted by the International Criminal Court. On and on and on. So personally, there's a grim picture, but I would love to hear from all of you respectively about, are there windows of hope about addressing root causes of conflict?
Mona, can we start with you?
Addressing, I mean, I absolutely agree with you in terms of exclusion being the root cause of the conflict in Yemen, but in terms of, at the moment, I think what is key, 2 days ago, the Human Rights Council report on Yemen was issued, which detailed that since the start of this recent conflict, 10,000 civilians had been either killed or injured in this conflict, and really described and a disregard for international humanitarian and human rights law by both parties to the conflict. And I think that until now, Yemen has not had an independent body to investigate those crimes committed by parties to the conflict. And I think that would be key for an international commission of inquiry in Yemen to investigate the actions of both warring parties, so that we can then start working towards, once all the fighting is over, hopefully we can start working towards more accountability. And so I think, for Yemen, definitely accountability is key in terms of, and I hope that once when a new agreement is brokered, that it's more inclusive, and that it's and also has regard for accountability. But also, I wanted to add that part of the resolution in Yemen is because the conflict on the ground has pretty much reached a stalemate, that a solution in Yemen really also will also rest with the obligations of the international community, the moral and legal obligations of the international community towards the people of Yemen. With the conflict no longer reaching a stalemate on the ground, we really need, and so recently the UK Parliament issued an inquiry into the arms trade into Gulf countries and how they were being used, as both warring parties are using landmines and cluster bombs in civilian areas. And so I think if that becomes more of a focus, and that local organizations in the country and globally can work together in flagging this and working together cohesively towards more accountability, I think that can serve towards a resolution.
I think you're absolutely right. It's about not only not inclusivity, but oppression. I mean, I think many of these, at least in the Kurdish case, many of these Kurds being in other countries feels like a forced marriage. You know, the man beats his wife, but every time she wants to leave, he says, "I love you," you know. It seems like the man, if he wants his wife to stay, he should be at least nice to her. So it's not just, Iraq was ruled for many years by the minority, the Sunnis. And after the 2003 war, Shiites became the biggest fraction, and then the Kurds, and then the Sunnis had their grievances, and let alone the other ethnic minorities and religious minorities in Iraq. Inclusion is very important, but in a place like Iraq where there's lack of trust, where there's a history of violent conflict, it's very difficult for these different sides to trust each other, so they keep making agreements and they go back on the agreements. For example, we had the 150 agreement, the Iraqi government of the disputed territories that were Arabized, the oil-rich regions, and they were supposed to make amendments for the Kurdish and Turkmen families to go back, but in practice it never happened. And at the end, the Kurds were forcing Arabs out in order to get their homes back, because the mechanism that's supposed to work for addressing some of these inequalities and injustices, they fail, they don't work. What is a window of hope? I personally believe working on the ground, working with the women's movement is very important for anyone who wants to make peace in the region. Women are usually doing a lot of brokering peace without really addressing it in that sense, addressing violence, going across communities and forming bonds with each other. And with the young people, I think the largest community in Iraqi Kurdistan are under 30. You know, and there are groups and groups of youth who are disillusioned and marginalized, and they form their own groups and they don't know what to do, and some of them unfortunately are recruited by radical Islamic movements and sometimes even by ISIS. So working with disenchanted, marginalized people and working with the civil society, including them in drafting any peace agreements, is very important. And we've been talking in the fellowship about how we as women have to be very prepared when a window of opportunity comes, when negotiations are being held. To be honest, I personally think we can't do it on our own, because we do all the fact-checking, we do all the drafting, we do all the willing to compromise on, you know, whether we want a secular constitution, Islamic constitution, women's rights and gender equality. We're willing to compromise, we collect signatures. At the end of the day, they don't listen. And I think unless an international actor or international NGOs backs us, it's very difficult for us to be included in those negotiations.
Yeah, okay. So inclusion, marginalization derives of the conflict. I mean, these are very complex drives for Syria, because it's like starting from the very beginning and thinking about the situation in Syria from the very beginning, the root causes that we are talking about. We should consider how the state or the government was reacting or dealing with the freedoms and in terms of authoritarian regime and being in power for so many years. That could be one of the main reasons why the conflict started. The diversity of the society, the different interest from different actors and counterparts in the Syrian situation made the situation more worse and more complex. I mean, these the things I have in mind, that the marginalization could be one of the things, but not everything. I would agree with Choman about young people and their inclusion, because they, the young people are very important part of the society and the largest population in the Arab world, and their contribution is very much needed for political sphere and to have more freedoms and at least for revolution and uprisings and the aspirations that we had. I mean, what the opportunities I see white helmets, for example, and I would like to encourage you all to sign up for them to win the Nobel Prize, because these are the people who are on the ground, young people who are trying to do with what they got and to protect the civilians, to focus on protection of people on the ground. They refused to leave. They are still there, working on the ground and helping people with what they got. I mean, they have all the opportunities to leave and leave everything behind and just letting everything for the international community to deal with. But they didn't. So I think this is one of the opportunities I see, how they are dealing with the situation, their mechanism that they developed over the years, and how they are reacting on the ground. I mean, these opportunities I see. Another thing is such venue and such fellowship introduced me to these remarkable women who our discussion made us I mean, it was so interactive. We learned so much from each other experiences, from the discussion we had. We challenged ourselves, and I found very much opportunities in the challenges that we all discussed during this fellowship. So, I mean, these are the opportunities. Some of these women are remarkable, and I mean, they would be the factors of change. Thank you.
Window of hope, that's... Well, it's amazing really how close our stories are. These are totally different countries when we talk about Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Palestine also with us. Sorry if I forgot anyone. But anyways, these are totally different countries. However, it's very strange how close our stories are. Libya lived under a dictatorship, more than 40 years under a dictatorship, an awful regime. So no one can deny Libyans that they wanted to get out of such a regime. Nation building is not an easy thing. And what better place to put that statement other than here in Scotland? It is a very difficult journey. I have no answers on the time scale and on the efforts needed, but I know it is not an easy journey. History tells us that. However, in Libya, I want to say two things. For Libya in particular, and also the rest of the countries in the region, but in Libya in particular, it was considered for years the fourth shore of Europe. It's that close. Our relation historically is in depth with the European community. However, at this stage in time, they're kind of the others, the Arab world and the region is the others. We're not the others. There is a legal and a moral obligation from the international community to help build these nations. We discuss how, but there is at least a statement. There is a moral and legal obligation. The war happening in Libya at the moment, after the 5 years of the revolution, is not a Libyan story only. It's a proxy war that definitely had lots of external interests in Libya. And the fight among, or the problems in Libya is not only from local interests and local inclusion, actually. And that's also a problem that we should start thinking about. What I can say is, as I stated before, is that this is not a regional story. It's history in the making.
And history on a global scale. As you can see, lots of ideas, lots of thoughts, but also many reminders that what happens in this region cannot happen only in the region. It has implications, and therefore it requires serious engagement. And the challenge for a chair in a conversation like this is to keep time and at the same time not prevent you from listening to the richness of the experiences. So unfortunately, we have time for 2 questions and 2 questions only. I'm going to ask that you identify yourselves, ask your questions, and I'll encourage you to please reach out to the amazing fellows, the first crop, and I hope not the last, of the fellowship, and to actually talk to them today and tomorrow. I think they'll have a lot to impart in terms of ideas and thoughts for all of us.
Hi, my name's Karen. Can I just first of all say thank you very much for bringing your stories and your experiences to us so we can actually hear from you what it's really like, because we are fed misinformation a lot of the time. And a very simple question, but I don't think a very simple answer. How can we help? What can we do?
Do I see another question, or should we take that one? It's big enough as is. All right, so why don't you ladies react to this
Well,
in
shall
closing?
I'll just go for a very simple answer. I think there are many practical things that people could help, at least the women on the ground do. I think one of the things that we need, the women's movement in general, is to document its work, to show what it's done, to form alliances, to become stronger and become a bigger player on the negotiation table. And sometimes the women on the ground have got all the skills, but they don't have the language, they don't have the skills of report writing, for example. They've got all the data, they don't know how to put it. I mean, there are many things that you could do if you commit yourself to a small organization and provide your help every now and then, even with editing documents. That will help them put a better report forward for their next project. That will make it successful for them to get the next funding. I think it's small, but it helps them a great deal.
I mentioned earlier the arms sales, and that there's going to be an inquiry to see if the arms sales license has been infringed, and that was a product of a lot of campaigning by organisations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and like Save the Children, Oxfam, and it's supporting those organisations in campaigning that those. That inquiry does take place, because at the moment the situation on the ground has really reached a stalemate, and we need some pressure, some external pressure that will bring both warring parties to a negotiating table and bring the fighting to an end. That's it.
I would be also very brief on this, but thank you for the question. It really shows how that the message we're here to give is delivered. How can you help? There's lots of things that you can help with, but the basic thing is to lobby for the stability of this region, because it's in your interest for this region to be stable. Now, how is that? Is to have more interest, and I'm talking on policy level. The country as a whole should show more interest, and it was just said this morning, 13 folds were spent on military action in Libya than was spent on civil action or civil efforts in Libya. So there is lots to be done from the higher level in the country.
And I will be accused of exclusion, but the team in the back indicates the next session is starting in a minute. So I fear that I'm going to ask Weamm to
Wrap it up. 2 words.
To say things very briefly, and I will not make any closing statement. We'll just leave it.
Thank you very much for your question. And I think by asking this question, you already offering help, and you can be capable of doing whatever you can in your own capacity. Maybe raising awareness would be one of these things. Maybe breaking stereotypes about hearing all of these experiences and reflecting to your society among your circles. We said yesterday that women's circles are very important because they are so influential on the base of their families, their husbands, and the community in general. So thank you.
Thank you all. Bravo, Elton.